So, a while back, I was watching a true crime show on one of the channels. I don't know if it was Oxygen or what. It was a TV show that was called, like, Cooking with Fire or something like that, and it focused around murders and other items, as you can maybe guess from the title, Cooking with Fire. But anyway, I was watching the show, and during the show, they don't show you any crime scene photos. They don't take you to the places where any of it happened. And I imagine they probably didn't show you anything because this happened back in the 80s. But the story itself, like, caught my eye. It was absolutely horrific. It was wild and crazy. Well, the day that show aired, I jotted down some notes, and I made it a mission of mine to get that information, to try to get crime scene photos, to try to find out the locations where the story took place so that I could tell it. So I have submitted a FOIA request to Rockdale County here in Georgia. That's the Rockdale County Courthouse behind me. And I have received photos and locations and all of that stuff. And so today I'm finally here. Today we're going to be talking about a young girl, and then one day out of the blue, she's in her apartment. Somebody knocks on the door and says, you got a phone call from the payphone out in front of your apartment. So she goes to pick it up, and she vanishes. No one saw what happened to her, but she wasn't heard of. And so her boyfriend files a missing persons report, and they start investigating, and come to find out his ex-wife was responsible for it all. And you're not going to believe what she did to this woman after the kidnapping. Like I said a moment ago, today I'm in Rockdale County, and this is the murder of Cathy Whitehead. It's very sad and very tragic. In 1983, 21-year-old Catherine Louise Whitehead Tucker, she went by Cathy, she lived right here in Rockdale County, and she was preparing to move in with her fiance, John Short. Now, Cathy had a great reputation, and everyone loved her. They thought that she was just the nicest person ever. She was so sweet. Cathy and her fiance John were just about to move in together, and they were looking forward to planning their future together. John had been married before to a woman named Hazel, and John and Hazel had been married for 21 years prior to this, and they had a couple of kids together. And if you think about it, Cathy was 21, John and Hazel had been married for 21 years, meaning that they got married like the same year Cathy was born. John claimed that Hazel was mean and cold to him on a regular basis. He said that she was evil and manipulative, and he claimed that she just made him miserable constantly. John was a police officer over in Porterdale County, which is the next county over, and one day he got called out to a theft call. Someone broke into a car and stole something, and the victim of that case was Cathy Whitehead. So the two of them met that day, and despite the fact that she was like 40 years younger than he was, the two of them started talking. So about a year after they started dating, they decided that they were going to move in together. Right before they were about to move in, John officially sent Hazel the divorce papers, which she did not sign right away. John left it alone. He didn't say anything. He didn't press the issue. But after nearly a year had passed, John and Cathy were so happy that he had asked her to marry him, and she immediately said yes. So it was here that John went back to Hazel and kind of pressed the issue a little bit and told her he needed her to sign the papers, and he told her that he had met Cathy and he was in love and that they were going to get married. Hazel told John that she would sign the papers, even though that she was very upset that he had left her for this younger woman. A friend of Hazel's would later say that Hazel told her that she was not going to sign the papers no matter what, that she wasn't going to let him leave her. Hazel was still hung up on John, and she was holding out hope that he would come back. A little more time passed, and John went back to Hazel for a third time, asking her to sign these papers. And it was here that Hazel told John that she was not going to sign the papers, and that she was not going to let him leave her for a homewrecker half of his age. And John pretty much had to flat out tell Hazel that their divorce had nothing to do with Cathy. He said it was all because of Hazel, and he told her that she was an evil woman, and he didn't want to be with her no more. Now, Cathy Whitehead worked for a catering company here in Conyers, and she was in charge of the kitchen. As she was preparing to move out of her apartment and in with John, strange things started happening to her at work. For starters, she had an employee working in the kitchen who was just a slob, and he was always late. He constantly got orders wrong, forcing them to have to redo it and costing them money. He just wasn't a great employee. So Cathy went to the owners about this line cook, and he ultimately got fired from the company. Now, shortly after this was the same time that where John had gone to Hazel for the third time to get her to sign the papers. So shortly after this, strange things started happening to Cathy, like she would get phone calls where somebody would ask for her, but then when she would go pick up the phone, no one would say anything, and she could just hear breathing on the phone. One day her car got keyed real bad, and Cathy started feeling like she was being watched every night after work as she was walking from the building to her car. She could just feel like somebody was sitting somewhere watching her. On top of that, Cathy started getting letters sent to her home that were all very aggressive and threatening. Like one of them said that you're gonna die for what you have done, B word. And these letters concerned Cathy. Now, Cathy had also been married before to a man named Frank Woods. Frank was very abusive to Cathy. He beat her up and hit her all the time, but they also had a child together. So Cathy hung out in that relationship for a couple of years before she finally got fed up with all of the abuse, and she wound up taking her child and she left. And it was like one of those where Frank left to go to work, and she packed up her bags real quick and left in the middle of the night and went into hiding so Frank wouldn't know where she was. And when all of this stuff started happening to her, the letters coming in and her car getting keyed and all that stuff, she told John that she thought this was her ex-husband. Maybe he had found her. And John reassured Cathy that he had no clue where she was, and he flat out told her then that he would protect her no matter what. On April the 14th of 1983, Cathy was here at her apartment with her mom. She was packing and getting ready to move out so that she can move in with John, when all of a sudden there was a knock at the front door. Cathy answers the door, and a young man that she doesn't know is standing on the other side of the door, and he says that he was down at the laundromat washing his clothes when the payphone out front of the office started ringing. So he went out and answered it, and on the line there was a man named John who asked him to come up to that apartment and get Cathy and have her come back to the phone saying that there was an emergency. Now, back in the 80s, it was a different time. We didn't have cell phones, and Cathy already had her landline service disconnected at her home. So Cathy started thinking to herself, who else would know that she did not have a phone at her home? Her mom was there. The only other person that would know would be John. So she immediately believed it, and she walks out of her apartment, gets in her car, drives around the corner to the office right here. There was a payphone sitting right out front, and that was the last time that Catherine Whitehead was seen alive, just as she walked out of her apartment and went down to the payphone. The next morning, Cathy's mom, who was at the apartment with Cathy that night, she said right after Cathy left to go get the phone call, she went to bed, and she had no clue that Cathy did not return that night. So she gets up early in the morning, and she realizes Cathy isn't there, and she realizes that nothing else has been touched in the house. So she knows that Cathy never came back after going to that phone call. So she leaves the apartment, walks over to the office, and she goes looking for Cathy. She saw Cathy's car sitting there. The driver's door was open, and the receiver on the payphone, it was just hanging down. It wasn't connected. So she immediately knew that something was wrong. So she hangs up that phone, and she uses that same payphone and immediately calls 911. And as soon as she's done talking to them and she knows that an officer's on the way, she dials John's number and she calls John to tell him what happened. And John also races over here to the apartment complex, and he actually makes it here before law enforcement does. So he and Cathy's mother explain what happened to the officers when they show up, and they tell them that they feel like something bad has happened. She just disappeared from the payphone. Almost immediately, a missing persons report is filed. Investigators come here to the scene, and law enforcement start looking for Cathy. The Rockdale Sheriff's Office, they would search for months, leaving no stone unturned, but they never found any sign of Cathy Whitehead. Investigators were able to track down every person who had anything to do with Cathy or John, and they were able to talk to them. They talked to the cook at the restaurant that had gotten fired because of Cathy. He had an alibi. His wife even verified that he was home all night. They spoke with John and Hazel's children, who said that they had no clue what happened. But investigators got their first red flag in the case when they talked to Hazel. And Hazel claimed that she didn't even know who Cathy Whitehead was. But law enforcement already knew that that was a lie, because just a few months prior, Hazel had gone over to John's apartment to pick up her son, and Cathy was there. She was enraged that Cathy was there in John's apartment, and she asked her son if that was who her dad was dating, and her son said yes. So Hazel walked right back in to John's apartment and smacked Cathy right in her face, slapped her right across the face, and told her that, "You're the reason why my husband left his family." So the son grabbed Hazel and got her out of there real quick. Afterwards, once John was told about all of this, because he was a police officer, he encouraged Cathy to file a police report and have documented proof that this incident happened. And she did just that. There was a police report showing that Hazel had slapped Cathy in the face. They didn't want to press any charges. They just wanted a report filed. So law enforcement had documented proof that Hazel was lying to him and that she knew who Cathy was. Ultimately, though, her lying to them really didn't go anywhere at this time, because Hazel had an ironclad alibi for the night that Cathy went missing. After John told the investigators about all of the letters and everything that she was getting and how Cathy thought it was her ex, Frank, who was threatening her, they were able to also track him down, but ultimately he was ruled out as well. He had no clue where Cathy was until this point. Now he knew that it was Rockdale County, because Rockdale County investigators came to talk to him. Investigators exhausted all of their leads. They talked to every person they could. They ran out of places to look, and Cathy Whitehead's case went cold. A whole year would go by with nothing happening on Cathy's missing persons case. The Conyers investigators started questioning whether or not Cathy could have just ran off somewhere, and her family and John, they all told them that this was ridiculous, that she had responsibilities. Her child was in the apartment with John. He was living with John at this time, so there was no way that she would just leave her child like that. Now, John and Hazel, they had 2 children together, Freddie and Tina. So Freddie went back and forth between John's house and Hazel's house, whereas Tina kind of resented her father for leaving her mom, and she pretty much stayed with Hazel all the time. It was during this time that this Tina, John's daughter, was dating a guy named Donald Glenn Everett. Now, I'm telling you that to explain this. About a year after Cathy's disappearance, Donald, who was guilt-ridden, he was in a bar one night. He was drinking, he was drunk, and he tells a stranger that's sitting next to him that he felt guilty and he needed to clear his conscience. He basically told this person that he needed to tell them, but they needed to keep it a secret. He just had to tell someone to get it off his chest. So Donald proceeds to tell the stranger at how he was involved in the death of a woman. This stranger who Donald was talking to was in disbelief at what he was saying, and although they promised to keep his secret, as soon as they left the bar, they went straight to law enforcement and told them everything that he said. So the next morning, when the Conyers investigators knocked at Donald Everett's door, he immediately dropped his head, knowing why they were there. Because Donald felt so bad about what happened, Like I said, he was guilt-ridden, and he knew that he had been caught. Donald sits down with the detectives and he tells them everything. He confesses to all of it, finally shedding light on what happened to Cathy Whitehead a year prior. Donald tells investigators that it was him who knocked on Cathy's door that night, telling her that John was on the phone. And he says that this whole thing was just to coax her out of her apartment. Cathy got in her car, drove around to the payphone, and as soon as Cathy got out and grabbed the phone, Hazel, John's ex-wife, grabs Cathy, throws her into the trunk of her car, and took off. Donald says that he and Hazel were in the front of the car with Cathy in the trunk, and they drove around almost the entire night with Cathy just locked in the trunk. She had not been hurt at this time, so she was just locked in this dark trunk all night, not knowing what was going to happen to her. Then Donald says at one point, Hazel pulls over to the side of the road. She gets out and she goes to the back of the car. She opens the trunk, and Cathy gets her first glimpse at what is happening, who is doing this to her. Donald says that he was sitting up front and Hazel popped the trunk. She didn't say nothing to Cathy. She just took a knife and she stabbed Cathy in her stomach once and in her leg. Not bad, just like, small cuts. But she stabbed her in her stomach and then a couple of times in her arm just to kind of punish her, just for fun. Hazel was stabbing Cathy just for fun. So Hazel slams the trunk again, gets back in the front, and they continue driving around with Cathy screaming in agony in the trunk. She's now bleeding everywhere in the back from being in pain and from being stabbed. So a few more hours go by when finally Cathy feels the car come to a stop. A few moments later, the trunk pops open again, and it's daytime now, so Cathy gets blinded by the sunlight after being locked in this dark trunk for so long. But as soon as the trunk lid pops open, Hazel snatches her out of the car and onto the ground here at this, it's an old trailer park. Now, this trailer park here, it looks a lot different today than it did back then. There were only a few trailers here, and Hazel owned a lot of land out here. She had junk cars everywhere. So they're here on Hazel's property, right here in this trailer park area, and Hazel pulls her out of the car. Hazel proceeds to start yelling at Cathy, telling her how she ruined her life. Hazel calls her a whore and insinuates that Cathy used her private areas to steal Hazel's husband. And this whole time, Cathy is on the ground, on her knees, pleading with Hazel to stop and asking her, why are you doing this? Cathy at one point said, I'll give you anything you want. Just please don't hurt me. But Hazel was vengeful and she wasn't having any of it. So Cathy is kneeling on the ground begging for her life. Hazel's pissed off at her and yelling and screaming. Cathy would have seen with her own eyes as Hazel picks up a gas can. Again, Cathy's begging for her life and pleads for Hazel to stop, but Hazel ignores her, and Hazel picks up the gas can, turns it up, and dumps gasoline all over Cathy. After Hazel empties the gas can on top of Cathy, Hazel then pulls out a Zippo lighter and she lights it, making sure Cathy can see it lit in her hand. And Hazel then takes one last jab at Cathy Whitehead by calling her a whore. This whole time, Cathy's looking up at Hazel, and Cathy starts to say something, but before Cathy can get anything out of her mouth, Hazel tosses that Zippo lighter onto Cathy, setting her on fire. Cathy obviously is screaming out in agony. After a few minutes, the fire goes out. Cathy is suffering. She's severely burned all over her body, but she's still alive. So Hazel then grabs a wire rope and she proceeds to strangle Cathy to death to finish her off. After Hazel and Donald Everett were sure that Cathy was deceased this time, they enlist Tina to come help dispose of Cathy's body. So they load up Cathy's lifeless body in the back of the car again, and they bring her here. Right here on the right, you can see there's this old shack looking building over here. Now, it wasn't an open area like this. It was way overgrown back in the 80s, but you could still see the old wooden barn that was already starting to fall down on itself back then. Now they've cleaned it out, but the three of them drive here to this old barn with Cathy in the trunk. And there used to be an old well out behind the home that had like a piece of plywood and an old sheet of tin from like a roof just sitting on top of it. So they moved that plywood and stuff, and they dumped Cathy's body down inside of that well. Then they put the plywood and stuff back on top of it, and then they just left and went back home and acted like nothing happened. Once they got back to Hazel's home, Hazel, Donald, and Tina all worked it out so that they all had the same story and that they all had an alibi. So when law enforcement went and talked to Hazel, Hazel told them that she was in a poker game with her daughter Tina and some of their friends. So when law enforcement went to verify her alibi, Tina and Donald told them the same thing, which all gave them an alibi. They all said that they were all in the same place together, and at first law enforcement took that as their alibi. Chances are we would have never found out what happened to Cathy Whitehead had Donald Everett not grown a conscience and squealed. So law enforcement, they're sitting there talking with Donald, and he's told them all of this information. Donald Everett was immediately arrested, placed in handcuffs, and charged with Cathy's murder. And then he took investigators to the well here behind this old barn, where they were able to recover the remains of Catherine Whitehead a year after her death. And then investigators left immediately from recovering Cathy's remains, and they immediately went looking for Hazel and Tina, but they were nowhere to be found. While they were on Hazel's property, they did some investigating and looking around when they found in Hazel's junk cars out here this Plymouth, and in the trunk of this Plymouth they found blood that they were able to positively identify and match up to Catherine Whitehead. Now, it had been an entire year, and apparently at some point during that year the car became inoperable and they were using it for parts or something in that point in time. But they were able to positively identify that this was the car that was used to transport Catherine Whitehead the night she disappeared. So they immediately put out an APB for Hazel and Tina nationwide. And shortly after the APB went out, Hazel was arrested in Texas. She was arrested and officially charged with Cathy's murder. And then a little bit later, Tina was arrested in Nashville, Tennessee, and she was also charged with Cathy's murder. All three individuals, Donald Glenn Everett, Hazel Short, and Tina Short, they all sat in jail waiting for their trial. They also arrested another person who was involved with the whole alibi scheme named Nicky, who was Hazel's nephew and Tina's cousin. But there just really wasn't enough evidence to hold them, so Nicky was arrested and then released, and all of their charges were dismissed. Now, while Hazel and Tina and Donald were waiting for their trial, Tina actually caused a little bit of a situation, because back in the 80s, she was a very pretty girl. So she was able to manipulate a guard, and she convinced this corrections officer to take her like on a shopping spree. He took her over to a mall and then took her to a fast food place and got her something to eat. And this caused problems, and the deputy actually wound up going under investigation and ultimately resigned because of this. Donald Glenn Everett was found guilty and convicted to life in prison for kidnapping. But in 1993, he was granted parole and was released. Hazel was also convicted of Cathy's murder, and she was sentenced to life in prison with parole. In 2018, she was granted parole and was released. And Tina Short was also found guilty and convicted of her role in Cathy's murder. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison, and she served 6 of those years before she was released on parole. After I filmed this episode, I have since learned that Tina Short is actually now back in prison. She was caught trafficking methamphetamine, so she's serving like a 40-year sentence in prison right now to this day. There's not a whole lot of information out there on what happened to John Short after all of this. I imagine he was probably crushed because he was so in love with Cathy Whitehead, and then she was brutally murdered at the hands of his own ex, and I'm sure that devastated him. His son, I would assume, probably moved in with him after all of this, while Hazel and Tina and all of them were locked up. And then again, I'm not really sure what happened to Cathy's son either, but I'm pretty sure he probably went to live with some of Cathy's family. As I said in the intro, this story was, I saw it on TV, and it was just the story. There was no pictures of Cathy or Tina or any of them, or the crime scenes or nothing. And I don't know what attracted me to the story. It was so heinous, and I decided then that I wanted to get this information that no one else had and get it out there and make this story. And you know, I've been preparing to talk about this story for some time now, as I've been gathering up all the details. That is going to do it for this episode today from here in Rockdale County, Georgia. I want to thank you all so much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you're new here, go down, hit that subscribe button, then hit that notification bell so you get notified every time I upload a video. Thank you all. I will see you again in the next one. Please, all of you, stay safe and stay healthy. Much love to you all.